welcome to one of the final sessions of this year's EAMS conference. We have with us Professor Chris Sangwin, and he's going to talk about STACK. It's an introductory training session for STACK. I will hand over to Chris in a moment, and if you have any questions, please remember to put them in Moodle. I'm going to paste the link to the questions page in our chat box. And now let's hear from Chris.
Morning, everyone. Thanks for your interest in coming to a STACK question authoring workshop. I'm Chris Sangwin from University of Edinburgh, and I'm the instigator, one of the lead developers of the STACK project. Matti Harada is one of the other lead developers. He's also in the meeting today. Thank you for coming along, Matti, and thank you for all your continued work and support on the project. It's much appreciated. What we're going to do today, there is a very practical session. Let me get my slides up and running. And okay, share my slides. I'm going to talk a very little bit about the STACK plugin. What is STACK? I'm going to talk a very little bit about the design philosophy. What is it that I'm trying to achieve with this project? And then the goal within this hour is to get to have everybody writing their own first question. Okay, so that's the goal. So STACK is a question type for mathematics. It's part of the Moodle quiz. It's also been ported to ILIAS. So in order to use STACK, you need to have a server with the software installed on it. If that's a problem, then we have some hosting options now. So if you want to talk to me about that later, I'm happy to help with that. But you will, the STACK is itself just a question type. It allows you to ask mathematical questions and deal with the student's answers. And in particular, STACK will generate random variants of questions. The student's answer contains some mathematical content. The system will establish mathematical properties of those answers with a full computer algebra system maxima, and then there are formative, summative, and evaluative outcomes. So formative is kind of feedback, summative is a numerical score, and then evaluative is some notes for statistical purposes. So let me just show you exactly what I mean. If we go to this is the STACK demo site. So if you go to STACK demo later, then we have a demonstration course, and there's a whole bunch of sample materials here which you can easily access. They're on Git. This whole course is on GitHub. If you come in to question 1, so here is an example question that I've already had a go at. I was demonstrating this yesterday. So the student's answer contains some mathematical content. So let's get this ludicrously wrong. The system validates their answer when you're happy that it's interpreted your answer in the way that you want it to, when there are no syntax errors and other validity errors, then the system will establish the mathematical properties. And so here is some feedback, some formative feedback. The derivative of your answer should be equal to the expression that you're asked to integrate. That was this. In fact, the derivative of your answer with respect to x is this. So what is happening internally, if I show you what's happening internally, this is the computer algebra system. So internally, the student's expression is assigned to a variable, and the computer algebra system is literally differentiating their answer with respect to x, and then in some way comparing it to the expression in the question, right? So that's the idea behind STACK. We generate random questions. The answers contain mathematical content. We establish mathematical properties of those answers. So there's some validity and some correctness. And then on the basis of that, there is feedback, summative, evaluative, and formative. And of course, the timing of that feedback will depend on the quiz settings that you've set up in Moodle. So the quiz that I've just demonstrated was designed for formative practice. So every question gets a check button and the feedback is immediate. All of those settings, of course, are under your control at the quiz level. Right. So today we want to author a question like that. Why did I build Stack? Well, I think assessment is the cornerstone of effective education. And I really think we need good questions. We need questions worth teaching to and assessments worth teaching to. And so I wanted to take responsibility for our assessments, and I want to enable question authors to write their own questions appropriate for their group and with the feedback that they want. And so at some level, we need to take some responsibility for the endeavor that we're trying to achieve. And mathematical assessment needs bespoke tools. So we need tools that will accept these algebraic expressions. And this has been obvious for a long time. I've been working on this in this area for over 20 years now, and there were plenty of people doing this last century. So we've got further and we have more sophisticated tools than we did before, but people have recognized the need for specific needs for mathematics for a very long time. And there's a lot of common ground between Stack and many of the other systems that you may have seen demonstrated during EAMS this week. So there's a lot of common ground between the different systems. Stack is widely used, has commercial partners, so the physics fundamentals folk use Stack to support their textbook. Although the software is open source, there's nothing anti-commercial about that. Quality needs to be paid for. So you know, it works at scale and it's reliable and there it is. Okay. One of the big advantages of Stack is that because it's part of the Moodle framework, it links into all the other advantages of a big international project like Moodle. So, for example, Stack supports multilingual questions, and that fits in with the other multilingual features of the Moodle system. So Stack is, and this is a significant contributory factor to Stack's success, I think. Right, so there we go. I've demoed the system. Key ideas in the design. So we should solve problems at the mathematical level, not at the display level. So you'll notice that I've typed in a mathematical expression, right? That's a key design feature in Stack. So if you want something like, right, you'll notice that the computer algebra system will do things to the expression. And these kinds of simplifications, if you like, are something which are part of the mathematics. We need this to establish equivalence. We need these, but we also want to turn them off. The ability to actually deal with a mathematical tree that represents the student's expression is key. And in particular, if you are developing a question, you know, solve this quadratic equation, and you do something like that, you know, you might want 1 times x, or you might not want 1 times x, right? And so this should be under control at the mathematical level. It's generally a very bad idea to try and substitute numbers into LaTeX, because if you substitute numbers into LaTeX, you'll end up with something like, you know, you'll end up with a plus minus thing. Whereas actually, if you solve these problems at the mathematical level, the mathematics knows that we don't normally write plus minus, we write minus in a sum. So, you know, one of the key ideas behind Stack has been to solve problems at the mathematical level. And now that is difficult and it requires some expertise, but it's like a hump you have to get over. And I absolutely think the results have vindicated that decision. Second key idea is to separate validity from correctness. So there was one example here. If we do something like, okay, so in this question, what we might do is x minus 4 to the power of 6 times 0.1666, right? And, you know, students tend to use floating point numbers as proxies for rational numbers. And in lots of areas of pure mathematics, this is a disaster, right? So if we come back to here, if we rationalize 0.16666, you know, it's 833 over 5,000. It is not, right? Oh, I've got simplification off. So turn simplification back on again, right? So 833 over 5,000 is not 1/6, right? And you can't have it both ways. So the separation of validity from correctness really is a key design feature, which stops students getting penalized on a technicality. So you'll notice that the students get this kind of validity feedback immediately. They don't wait for check. In fact, if you can't think about this, because this is invalid, the system won't think about it. The student won't get marked. They won't get penalized for this incorrect thing, because we all know that that probably means, you know, 1/6, right? So we want the students to do that, and then they'll get some other feedback. Well, okay, so I need to add a constant integration, but that's a different property. So this business of separating validity from correctness is one of the key design features in Stack. It's absolutely essential, and it's really useful in the multi-part question design. So validity is tied to the inputs, but correctness could involve more than one of the inputs. So if we go to the next question here, in this question, imagine you're doing you've got a car moving along a table in a physics lab. How far did the car go? Okay, well, I was demonstrating scientific units yesterday. Okay, 3.0 meters. How long did it take? 2 seconds. Well, the system is going to moan here that we don't have enough information. So let's do 2.0 seconds. And what's the speed? 1.5. Right, but you need scientific units before you can think about it. So this business of separating out validity and correctness, the validity is tied to the input, but the correctness actually involves more than one of these inputs, right? Your calculation of the speed is consistent with the data you measured, right? So you've measured 2 of these and then you calculated on your measurements. So that the correctness actually involves 3 inputs, but the validity of each input is tied to that input. So the separation out of validity and correctness is a key design feature. And I should say there is no mark this part button by design, because well, it's not clear what a part is. Anyway, that's a more advanced feature. I will talk about that later. And the last thing is one of the key design features in Stack, if we go to the previous question, is these question tests for quality control. So if we come in here, it is much better to randomly generate variants of the question. So here are all the variants of the question that I've pre-generated. It is much better to pre-generate these random variants and then test them. Now, the test cases, of course, have to be in terms of the student's answer. So here I have constructed a test case based on the variable TA, and I've added a constant integration. So in this case, the variable actually turns out to be this expression, which is valid, and it's scored, and it gets a score of 1, and I expected a score of 1, and there is this. This is a note for statistical purposes, which we'll come on to later. And this test passed, right? So this expression test passes. Here we're missing a constant integration. Here it looks like you've differentiated instead, and I've created a test case from the variables, evaluated this for simplification, and so on and so on. And you can test that that actually floating point numbers are not permitted, right? So that gets a null. There is nothing here because it hasn't been assessed. It's invalid. So that test passes because we are confirming that an invalid answer is actually caught as invalid. And the big advantage of this is that we can run all those test cases on all those random versions, and you can be confident that none of your random versions have done something like a division by zero error or created an impossible situation, right? And anyone coming to this next year will have the same confidence, and anyone else looking at your questions will see how many marks you've given and what they're given for. So I've given no marks for constant integration, right? That's pretty harsh. You might want to give half marks. That's your business, but you can see what I've done and why I've done it by looking at these test cases. So this test case construction for quality control is absolutely key. Okay, so let's write a question. So the goal for the rest of today is to go through and write a question. So let's go to the EAMS site. Before we do that, any questions so far? Let's just pause for questions. Anyone got any questions?
Yeah, Chris, I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go for it.
So, what can I ask about the philosophy of the creation of Stack?
Yeah.
What were you thinking at the inception? I'll explain this some context, because I've been using, I think, web work, and I'm armpits deep in web work at the moment. Like
a thoroughly decent system written by very competent colleagues, and
so I was wondering that you explained. I think you explained about because I'm not sure. You know, I've watched various presentations, and I'm not sure about.
Right, that's easy. That's absolutely easy, Zach. I wanted a full computer algebra system.
Yeah.
Right? That was my goal. Web work don't have that. They've got various libraries that they've worked over the years, which are building their own computer algebra system. Other people have built their own computer algebra systems, right, when they realized they needed it. I started out with it because that's what I wanted. That has its own problems. It has its own difficulties. Web work did a great job with materials bank and community development. I mean, they have all these national question banks, don't they? So that's their real strength, I would say. Stack has huge question banks now as well, but I put my effort into the mathematical integrity.
Right.
Right, and that's the big advantage of Stack. The disadvantage is it's more difficult to install. There are systems that are much easier to install, right? And the designers I could talk at length about the differences, and I did talk about a lot of these principles in a book that I wrote nearly 10 years ago about computer-aided assessment and mathematics. So if you want, and I compared web work with what I've done in there in detail, and some of the other systems. If you really want my thoughts 10 years ago on the reasoning and philosophy, then have a look at that. It's sorely up the chapter comparing the systems sorely needs updating, especially in the last 2 years. That's my job this summer, is to write a kind of a detailed comparison of the different systems. But if you want to see what people were doing in the 1960s, have a look in here, because some colleagues were doing some fascinating stuff very early on. So
I mean, I've read a little around on the web, and I noticed that a colleague in Australia, I think, who expressed that they are transitioning from web work because for creative teachers who are not, probably the best coders, that they find that the numbers, I think, which is Stack the engine under numbers, is it?
No, Numbers is Christian's project.
All right, it's a set up, right.
So Zach, I'm going to cut across you here, because my job today is to promote Stack and get people writing Stack questions. Now, I think there's definitely a place for a session where we honestly compare these things, because I know the web work folk. I've worked with them for years. I've met them. I know Christian, who writes Numbers, very well. We chat a lot, not enough, I think, and we could collaborate more, but that's life, isn't it? So I think there is scope for a real discussion about the relative goals, the different priorities, the features, where we've got to on the development track, what we've spent our time doing, and therefore you can decide on the relative merits related to your particular goals and institutions. I think that would be a very good session, but that's not the session today.
Yeah, sure.
I'll just suggest we have a free chat session tomorrow afternoon to end the conference.
Right.
That would be a nice thing to bring up during that.
Yeah, okay, let's do that.
I noticed that on the programme, so I look forward to that. Yeah.
Good question, Zach, because it really matters. I mean, when you first come into this, it's sort of bewildering, isn't there? All these systems, and we've all got our own agendas and all the rest of it. So it is difficult. It's difficult to figure out what the landscape is.
I mean, I noticed the kind of very relative you know, I'm picking up some of the merits of like stack and numbers, and I'm interested. You know, there could be a world in which I use both, but
there could well be, right?
Yeah.
So, and I know that there are, colleagues who have campuses in China have problems with proprietary software that they can't get through the Great Firewall, so they have to use things like Numbas in China, but they use other things in different locations.
Yeah.
So anyway, okay, this is the topic.
Okay. Sorry, apologies.
Stack. No, good question, and I'm very happy to talk about it. Right, we should be talking about these issues more.
Yeah.
But just not today. So, what we're going to do, Christian has very kindly installed Stack on the EAMS site, so you're already teachers. So, if I can show you where to go, let's go back. So, what I was showing you, I think I'm back sharing. What I was showing you was on the Stack demo server. So this is my demonstration site. So let's get rid of that, and let's get rid of that, and let's go to EAMS. So if we go to the EAMS play area, I think everybody here, and I can put this URL into the chat. Right, so what we're going to do is we're going to go through the author quick start guide, right? And one of the design decisions I made very early on is that when you get the Stack software, the documentation for the whole system is distributed with the software. So if we go to the EAMS site, and under question type Stack doc is the documentation. And if you want to find out what version you're running in your own server, then it tells you here, right? So, and that is a date, that's the release date. So this is the version that we released, very recently. So at the beginning of the month, okay. And what we're going to do is we're going to go to the authoring quick start guide. And we are just going to get a minimum working question working. Now I have used this author quick start guide, and I have shown hundreds of people how to use Stack using this author quick start guide. Okay, so we're going to do it. I'm going to suggest we do it this way. I will run through this page reasonably quickly once and get a working question. And then I will go back to the beginning and we will go through line by line, and you can copy and paste from the web page into your own browser and get your own working question, right? And the reason for doing it twice is if we try and all do it together the first time round, I will lose somebody and they'll have a window open and they won't have Zoom open and all the rest of it. Is that okay? I'm sorry to be directive and didactic about this, but I have done this a lot before and I've done it a lot on Zoom, right? Is that okay? Because there are some things like finding the question bank in Moodle that are surprisingly difficult. And if you miss that, you're going to get stuck. Okay, so that's the plan. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly myself. So we go to the author quick start guide. This video will show you how to find the Moodle question bank, if you watch that. However, every Moodle is slightly different. So Christian is using a different styling of Moodle than I'm using on the Stack demo page, right? So where you find the question bank on your different versions of Moodle, if you've got Moodle at home, your question bank might be here. On the Moodle we're using today, is more question bank. So what we have to do is come to the EAMS Moodle, into the play area, more question bank, and that will bring you into the question bank, okay? And having arrived in the question bank, we are going to create a new Stack question. So getting to this point is often a stumbling block, right? So that's what this video is all about. Now, we're going to assume that you have access to a course with Stack installed. So thank you, Christian, for setting all that up. And I'm going to assume that you're reasonably familiar with LaTeX for formatting maths, right? So if not, we can talk about that later, but I'm just going to assume that. And we are going to create a minimum of an absolutely minimum Stack question. So go to your course and navigate to the question bank and create a new stack question type. So here we are. Okay, new stack question type. And if we look at this question, this field, this form is really very complicated. And then you get to the bottom and it gets even more complicated, right? And so this is a kind of, this is an intimidating form. But there are only 4 compulsory fields in this form. So to get a minimum working question, we're only going to have to do 4 things. We need to give the question a name, right? We need to actually type in some text, which is shown to the student, which is the question, right? Do this. You as the teacher need to provide an answer. Now that doesn't actually have to be correct, although it probably should be correct, but something that you claim is a correct answer. And that will be shown to the student later. There's a part of the quiz, some of the settings in the quiz will allow you to say, and the teacher's answer is this. So that's what's shown to the student there. And then we need a test of correctness that will decide if this, whatever the student types in, is also correct, right? Now, the model answer that you type in might not be unique. There might be lots of different things that would be judged correct. You know, they might up to equivalence or whatever. So, and also the system doesn't automatically check that what you claim is a correct answer will be given full marks. Okay, so we'll come back to that. But anyway, to get a question working, there are just 4 things. You have to give the question a name, you have to say what the question is, you have to say what your answer is, and then you have to have a way of deciding whether an answer is correct or not. So it's actually not that, it's not that big a deal. So the question author quick start guide suggests that you call your question question 1. Now, if we all call our question question 1, it will be chaos. So I suggest you use your initials, and I'm going to call mine CJS 1. So we type in the question into question 1. And then the next thing to do is to come into the question text, right? And the question is going to be differentiate x minus 1 cubed with respect to x. So what we do is we just copy differentiate x minus 1 cubed with respect to x, and we copy that into this box. Right. Now you'll notice, having copied this, that it's actually, because this is HTML, I'm looking at the raw HTML code, it has copied all the pre-tags, which is not actually what we want to do. We just want to copy that in. So I suggest strongly that if you're going to write stack questions in anger, that you don't use this default editor that very helpfully copies the formatting, which you often don't want, and that you actually just look at the raw HTML, okay, and that you just get used to that. Right, so we have copied the, you can change your default preferences, but for today we'll just go and look at the raw HTML because there's a very few things to copy. So that's the question, and again there are some notes here. Moodle, I've already said this, Moodle has a wide choice of text editor. Cut and paste may or may not include some of the formatting, and you know, that depends on your browser and all sorts of other things that are not inside my control. So just be aware of that. The text contains some LaTeX environments. So because of currency and conflicting with currency, you shouldn't use these LaTeX environments. You have to use these ones. I think it's I was quite interested that for inline maths, people use that, and for displayed maths, people use that. So there's a lot of colleagues use a mix of these 2 different styles. So Stack insists on that. Now, if you have a lot of legacy materials, you can just do a one-time replace. I have a very low tolerance of tedious stuff. So if you can cut and paste from pre-existing materials, but actually Stack will convert those so that dollars don't conflict with currency in business. Internally, you'll notice inside the question, I've got these tags. We've got an input tag and a validation tag. So these tags get replaced by, this will get replaced by the input box, and this will get replaced by the feedback, the validation feedback. And internally, the student's answer will be assigned to a variable name. It is literally the variable name ans1 in Maxima. So you will have a variable ans1. So I've got ans1 here, and literally there will be a variable ans1, and it will be assigned to whatever the student types in. Okay, right. So there will be a variable answer1, and this tag denotes the position of the box into which the student types their answer, and it will be replaced by the feedback. This tag will be replaced by the feedback. Okay, so if you've got missing brackets or syntax errors, that's where those errors will appear in your question. So for multi-part questions, you might want to reposition these, and that's how you reposition the feedback, by changing these tags. Right, so as I'm going through this script, folks, I hope this will give you some confidence that the documentation is there, it's comprehensive, this is where you find it. So if you don't follow everything first time, and it is a sophisticated system by design, so there's a lot to learn, I hope you've got confidence that you can go back and work through this Auto Quick Start guide again, and that the stuff is all there that you need to know. Okay, so that's one reason I'm going through this quickly and slowly now. We have comprehensive documentation. Okay, so we've given the question a name, and we've given the question an input, answer1. Sorry, we've given the question a name, and we've stated the question. The next thing to think about is input answer1. So I'm going to scroll down to the input section of the form. And this is, by default, a question comes for free with one answer. If you have multi-part questions, there's a next section in the Quick Start guide will explain how to deal with multi-part questions. But a one input to start with. And there are lots of different types of input. You can have an algebraic expression, checkboxes, drop downs, matrices, all this kind of stuff. And then there is this bewildering array of options. Are we going to forbid floating point numbers? Yes. Are we going to check the type of response? There is help here. So different types. If the student types in an equation, do you want to reject that? So if you check the type of the response, it will do some kind of type checking. Anyway, there is help, and there's more help. So, but we're not going to change any of these options. All we're going to do is we're going to type in a minimum correct answer. Right? So into the model answer, that's a minimum correct answer. And you'll notice here that this is using maxima syntax. So for any expression in this system which has mathematical meaning, you have to use maxima syntax, which is all very simple, pretty uncontroversial until you get to the inverse trig functions, right? I mean, you need to use a star for multiplication, but that encodes the meaning. You're allowed to use LaTeX up here, but you can't use LaTeX here, right? LaTeX doesn't encode the meaning; it just encodes the display. And then the last part. So what are the notes? Yes, the students. Yep. So the student's response will ultimately be that variable name. The model answer must be valid. Syntax. I've said that. Input types. And multiple parts I've discussed. Okay, so I've been through all of the things to do with the input. And now the last thing is, how do we decide if a student's answer is correct? So to do this, we have a potential response tree. And this is the complicated part of the system. So what this is a way of encoding an algorithm that establishes the objective properties of the student's answer. Okay. That's what we want to do. So we want to have an algorithm that will make decisions based on the student's answer. And by default, the question contains one of these. So one of these trees, and it's called PRT1 by default, right? So if we go back to the question, this tag will be replaced by the feedback. Now you could move this tag here. You can put the tags anywhere you like. But the Moodle system has a difference between specific feedback and question text, and you can control these with the timing of the quiz, right? So anyway, by default, the feedback will appear there, which will actually be outside your question. So how do we configure this tree? So what this is it's a graph. The student will traverse this graph. And at each node in the graph, we will do something. So we will take the student's expression, answer1, and we will compare it with another expression using the test algebraic equivalence. So what this node does, you start at node 1, and the system says, using algebraic equivalence, is answer1 equivalent to the teacher's answer? And if all the tests only return true or false. And if that test returns true, then we go down the true branch and we will modify the score to be equal to 1. and we can give some feedback. Right, and we can give some feedback here. Oh, is not equivalent. And to start with, we only have one test. We're just going to test equivalence. Now, you can establish more than one property with complicated trees, and in order to do that, we'd have to add another node. But to get a minimum question working, all we have to do is establish that the student's answer is algebraically equivalent to the teacher's answer. Okay, so that's fine. Right. And now I'm going to save my changes. So I've now got a minimum working question. And there are no errors on here. If, for example, I had a syntax error and I'd missed out my multiplication sign, then it would tell me, you know, I've got some syntax errors. So we've been as forgiving as we can, but ultimately you have to have valid maxima here. So what did we do? We gave the question a name. We posed the question to the student. I claimed an answer which is correct. I decided what test was relevant here, and I tested algebraic equivalence of the student answer with this expression, and that was it. So I'm going to preview my question. So if I do 3 times x squared minus 2 times x plus 1, and submit and finish that, that's correct, right? This expression is algebraically equivalent to the derivative of that. This illustrates the different Moodle quiz settings. So here, this is deferred feedback. This is a kind of behavior that you might have for an exam. If I wanted to have a more formative setup, I could have the checkbox on each individual question, and that is an adaptive mode, right? So these are Moodle quiz options. If I fill in the correct answer, that's what I'm claiming is the correct answer as the teacher. Sure enough, that is marked as correct. If I get something wrong, here is the validation feedback, and that's wrong, right? So that's basically how you get a minimum question working. Yeah, right. And I make no apologies. This is by design supposed to allow teachers to be sophisticated, right? So the complexity is all there because it's necessary. This is not a commercial project. I'm not trying to make this look flashy. I'm doing this. Every feature has been added because somebody really needed it, right? And there's some real use case, some valuable educational use case for all these options. Okay. Any questions at this stage before we go back through it again? Yeah, just unmute. Yeah, that's great.
I just had a question considering saving of the questions. If it works to save a question that is not correct.
Yes, so this is a restriction in Moodle, which is a long-standing annoyance. Moodle will not allow you to save a broken question, right?
Yeah. Okay.
Now, when you're only doing multiple choice questions, and there's something simple like your numbers should add up to 100%, it's a perfectly reasonable design decision on the part of the Moodle community to say, you can't save a broken question, just fix it now. Stack questions might need a technical expert to help you fix it. So the decision to not allow an author to save a broken question and then email an expert and say, could you look at my broken question, is a disaster, right? Now, I think that might change in Moodle 4 because we've been talking to the Moodle community about that. So what you would have to do is somehow copy and paste something to allow you to save your question. It's not satisfactory. This is, you have very quickly found one of the downsides of collaborating with a bigger community, is that not all design decisions are under your control. Okay?
I see.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Kathleen. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question. It's not mine, it's of my colleagues. They asked me, what's the use of make such question that you have, the example that you just given, for stack? Why don't you do that kind of question, just short answer or numerical question? Because I make questions with stack Yeah, my English is not so very good.
Okay, no rush.
With that can change the numbers, the variables.
The variables,
change.
yes.
Yeah, and that's why I use stack. But my colleagues asked me, why do you use stack if you don't change the variables?
Because,
do you understand my question?
Yes, absolutely. The computer algebra system has two big advantages. One is creating variables. So that's one advantage. Okay. And actually, it's a little bit silly in most situations. It's silly when you're creating questions to do this and substitute in values and then say factor, factor that. It's much better to take something and reverse engineer it. Right, and then to substitute in the variables, because you know that this expression will factor, right? So you do need the computer algebra system to generate mathematical questions that will work reliably. Just plugging in numbers will not work, okay?
Yes, yeah, of course,
right.
Yeah.
Okay, so for randomly generating questions, you definitely need the computer algebra system. If you want your student to type in a mathematical expression, you absolutely need the computer algebra system. Okay, because you will want to make some subtle distinctions. The first question just checks algebraic equivalence, but you might want other forms. You might want to say, is this expression factored? So you might want to do both. You might first test, is it algebraically equivalent? And then you might say, is it also algebraically equivalent and factored? Or you might say, well, you've given me a factored expression, but it's not equivalent to the correct answer. A very
for giving feedback, good feedback.
So to give good feedback, you want to make lots of judgments. And to establish those properties, you need the computer algebra system.
But our students find it not so easy to use the right type, the right.
Yes. Okay.
So we have to learn them how to use and how to type the right expressions. Or
so you know your group best. I don't know who you teach. They're your students. There are lots of options for typing expressions, and I and everybody else working in computer-aided assessment have put a lot of effort to make it as easy as possible for students. But I'm at a leading university. I'm teaching STEM students at a leading university. They have to learn how to type a simple expression into a machine. Come on, right? So I want to make it easy. The separation of validity from correctness really helps make sure we don't penalize a student for something like a missing bracket or forgetting not to use floating point numbers. Right. So they get that immediate feedback even in an exam in my design. So in practical terms, this is very rarely a problem. It's very rarely a problem for our students. For very young students who are just learning algebra, it might be a different story. Okay, that's a different group of people. But then they're only typing in very simple things anyway. Okay, good question, a really important issue. Let's go back and I would like in the next 10 minutes to get everyone with a working question, right? Is that reasonable? Just so you've got some confidence, you can come back, and there are 8 parts to the Author Quick Start Guide, and we're only going to do one of them. So if you're interested in this, you are going to have to come back and have another look, right? We can only get started today. So let me share my screen again, and I will try and go through this slowly. Right, so back to the my courses, EAMS 2022. Play area. Oh, it was in the quiz, wasn't it? I've gone wrong now. Was the play area something different? Software demos? No.
If you click on the dashboard at the very top of the page, Chris,
Dashboard, thank you.
there's
Play area, thank you. Right, okay, go to the player. Thank you, Christian. Every Moodle site is different, isn't it? It's like wandering around in the wilderness. Okay. Or a forest, you're in a forest. More question bank. So everybody got to the question bank. So dashboard, play area, more question bank. Hope everyone's got to the question bank. Okay. And here's the Author Quick Start Guide. So I will just again post the Author Quick Start Guide in the chat. It's very useful to have a system with two windows, but I will just alternate between these two tabs. So to create a minimum working question, we need the question name. So I'm going to call my, we need to go to create a new question, scroll down to the bottom, and it's the stack question type. There's nothing wrong with these other question types. I use multiple choice questions. We had that, why using a stack question? Multiple choice questions definitely have their place. So there's nothing wrong with those, but we're going to use stack. Okay. So to author a stack question, we need to give a question name. So I'm going to call it CJS question 2. And then the next thing we need to do is to come in here and we need to actually copy the question text. So I'm just going to copy the question text. And to get to the editor, I'm going to push this down button on the left, which reveals more options. And then I'm going to go to the raw HTML and I'm just going to bin all that and paste in my question. Okay. And then the next thing to do is to give something which I'm claiming is the correct answer. So input answer 1. And that is we scroll down to the input and then we have to expand this section of the form, whereas there's this arrow. So and then the last thing that we need to do is to establish a test of correctness. So we're going to check answer 1 is algebraically equivalent to this expression, which I've still got in my cut and paste buffer. And there are lots of other answer tests. I mean, there are a whole range of other properties like factored form or numerical tests for significant figures and so on, right? So, but we're going to use the prototype, which is algebraic equivalence. And I'm not going to bother with any feedback here. I'm just going to save changes and continue editing. Okay, so if you now save and continue, if you press save, you'll go back to the question bank, and I hope you've given your question a distinctive name, or you're going to not be able to find the question you've just authored. Go to the preview. Thumbs up when you've got something working.
While you're waiting, Chris, is there a link to the documentation from within the question editor, or do I have to find it by another route?
If you click on the question marks,
yeah,
and go to more help.
Oh, some of them have that. The ones I tried didn't. Thanks.
Documentation contains two different roles, right? The first role is reference. So if you click on those links and there's more help, then it will take you to the reference section. But then the author quick start guide is a different kind of documentation, which is a more tutorial kind of documentation. Now, as the system grows and as more people get involved, we're trying to improve the two roles of this documentation. Okay, so some general Moodle features. So the Moodle quiz has all sorts of options, and you're asking about the needs checking. So the needs checking, right? So some Moodle questions are human marked, right? Whereas Stack is not human marked. So I don't think Stack will need checking. I think that's one of the essay question types where the human has to go in and mark it.
No, that's some new feature I haven't seen yet. That looks at the stats of a question and looks whether all answers are incorrect that are delivered or something like that. And I've never seen that feature before.
So which version of Moodle are we using?
If you no, which version is mine?
Chris, we're on 4.0 stable. So I know that not everything in Stack works with Moodle 4, but I thought enough for this demo. We're not going to bump into the things I've seen you comment about.
Brave, that's brave. Right, so yeah, please don't install a live system on Moodle 4 yet if you're running this next session. So as you can see, the core of Stack works well, but Moodle have introduced some very interesting question versioning. So you've now got the history of the edits to your question and how that interacts with some of the automatic testing procedures. You know, if you add a test case to one version, what happens to the later version? We have fixed all this. I'm confident it works, but it's not on the code that we're running. The fixes are not on the code that we're running here. Okay. Right, I'm just going to very quickly, lightning tour, just show you a little bit more of the documentation. So the next part of the author quick start guide explains how to introduce variables into your question. Right, so using question variables. The next part of the author quick start guide talks about improving feedback. So here you'll be using some of the other inbuilt answer tests and putting in more nodes. So that you're testing more than one property. Then the next step is how to introduce random questions. So you create a whole bunch of randomly generated variables and how you deploy random versions. And then you come on to section 5 is how to automatically test your questions. There will be problems with this part of the system on Moodle 4. So if you get this far, I'd be very happy to let you have access to our general Stack demo site, and that's running an older version of Moodle, which is absolutely 100% reliable. So if you get this far in the author quick start guide, or you're interested in taking this further, it might be better to move servers at some point. Until I'm about to release a new version that will support Moodle 4. So don't be worried about that. It's all going to come along, but I just haven't released it yet. Then we get on to multi-part questions, how to create questions with more than one input box. And what you basically do is you put more of these tags in. So input 1, input 2, input 3, right? I mean, that's how you put in more parts. But then you have more complicated trees and follow through marking. And then the most difficult part of the whole thing is actually fine control over simplification. So how do you actually, how do you deal with simplification? And there is some documentation on how to set up a quiz, although that's nothing to do with Stack really, it's to do with Moodle, but we have got documentation on basically setting up a quiz. And then in here, there is comprehensive documentation. So if this is more reference now, but if you want to know what are all the answer tests and how do the answer tests work, there are, here are the equivalence tests. So we have all different, not just algebraic equivalence, but we have a whole nuanced form of equivalence. And all sorts of interesting kind of test cases and so on. So the documentation is quite comprehensive, and there's some interesting maths here. You know, what does it mean to write something in partial fractions? Which of the following of these are factored and why, right? I mean, this polynomial has a whole bunch of different things that you may or may not decide are factored depending on which field you're using. Yeah, so it's a sophisticated tool, and if you want to be sophisticated, then there's stuff to learn, right? But I hope I've reassured you that if you want simple questions and all you want is algebraic equivalence, it's perfectly sane to write some simple questions, right? And that's where everyone gets started, and I hope that gives you some confidence that this is possible.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you very much. We are in the final couple of minutes of this session. Just reiterating one question Moisha has in the chat. Where can we find this documentation?
Right. So the documentation is distributed with the source code. So the most reliable source for the documentation will be on the server you're using, right? So let me show you that here. So in EAMS, I'll go back to the site home for the documentation, right? So documentation home, here we go. If we are in EAMS Moodle, then you just add question type stack. So that's where we are. You add that in. I'll put this in the chat. Whichever server you're using, you just add that, and that's where your documentation is. So in the EAMS Moodle, it's question type stack doc. On my stack demonstration site, we go to stack demo, and we add in that, and sure enough, the documentation comes up for this. And if you scroll to the bottom, you'll note that we didn't update our web server this year here, whereas the EAMS site, wherever it is running a different version. So if you want to know which version you're running, you will have the documentation for the version you're running on your site. That's why we distribute the documentation with the system, so that you can check whether the feature that you want is on the system that you're using. So Christian is ahead of my public demo server. We're about to release a new version and update everything. So there we go. We also have a public website, which is, if you go to stackassessment.org, this is the public website for the whole project, and the documentation is here. And this is exactly the same as the documentation, right? Authoring quick start guide, This is what you've just done, and this is exactly the same. Of course, this website will always be the latest one, which may not be what you have on your server, right? So there may be features on the public documentation that you don't have yet. So, as you would expect.
So for someone wanting to someone wanting to practice or understand, this is the best website to start with, right? The one that you showed just now?
Well, I think the best place to start is on the EAMS website. You're all teachers there already. Just get started, play around. Christian, thank you, Christian, for setting all that up. It's really appreciated to give everyone such easy access. If you want to, I mean, I'd be very happy to give anyone a teacher account on our demo server. That's what it's for. So if you want to do that, you can move stuff over. The question banks on the demonstration site, at the very beginning of this talk, I had gave you a quick view of the demonstration site. Those are all publicly available questions. We do have big question banks. And again, we can help you navigate those question banks. Keeping your electronic office tidy is not an easy problem. It's nothing to do with Stack. You will have the same problem in WebWork and Numbas and every other system, right? So navigating your question banks and matching up those questions and finding one with the right topic and the right difficulty and all the rest of it is not easy. So you sort of have to be a little bit organized and tidy. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you, Chris. With that, we are out of time. Thank you for your very detailed, very informative presentation. I think I'm going to try using Stack in my future works. And I would also like to thank Christian Lawson Perfect and Chris Graham for joining us today. Our next session is at 4 o'clock this afternoon, GMT +1 time, converted to your time zone. Thank you for joining in, and we will see you in the next session. Goodbye.